and learning event. We're now started to record. So thank you for joining us. If I could take to the next slide where we will do the usual meeting protocol. So the next slide is just some of the meeting protocols that we have today, which I'll leave up for a few moments. I'm sure many of you are used to virtual events, but just to remind you, keep your microphone on mute throughout the conference to minimise any background noise. It makes it slightly easier when we've just got the speaker's microphone on. We would encourage you to use the chat function in two ways. So to pose questions to the speakers, and if you have a particular question that you want a particular member of the team or the speakers to ask, then please put their name there. And also to make any observations or comments. So if when the speakers are informing you of information, if you would like your input, then please do pop any information on there. The chat function is being manned by a team, and they will respond to you if able, or store the question so that it can be answered at the end of the event. As I've said, we are recording this, so please be aware and note that any comments or questions in the chat will be anonymised for future use. If you want to get in contact with us after the event, please contact us on the email noted on the slide, which is ted@linksymca.co.uk. And obviously with technology, which we're all used to now, but it does have the occasional blips if it's not working. We have got one of our tech leads available today, Sharon, who can be contacted on the number 01529 301 953. Next slide, please. So this is me. My name is Jane Adams, and I'm the TED Programme Manager. And this afternoon, I'm helping facilitate this event. The TED team and speakers will give you an insight into the work we've done with AWOC, Aging Without Children. So please enjoy and do engage during the event with the chat function. Thank you. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may not be familiar with TED, this is a very brief background of what TED is about. So it's part of the Aging Better, the 7-year programme set up by the National Lottery Community Fund. We are one of 13, so there's 14 Aging Better partnerships based in England doing this similar work. And the Aging Better partnerships explore creative ways for people aged over 50 to be actively involved in the communities, helping to combat social isolation and loneliness. And it was set up as a test and learn from new approaches, which means that we have been able to really adapt the way that we have run things, led things, engaged with organisations and individuals over the past 7 years. And we've worked with individuals, groups and organisations since the programme started in East Lindsay in 2015. Next slide, please. So our aim, and this is very similar to the aim of the Aging Better programme, is to ensure that people living in East Lindsay and aged over 50 feel less isolated and lonely. They become actively involved in their communities. And as a result of that, it means that they become engaged in the design and delivery of services that improve their social connections. So we work with people and not assume that people will want certain things without speaking to them. To be recognised for their positive contribution to society, and ultimately feel more positive about ageing and the related opportunities this presents. Next slide, please. So how did TED become involved in AWOC? And I'm very aware that we've got a lot of speakers on this event, and I don't want to take any of what they're going to say. So I'm going to just do a little bit of a brief rundown of how it came about. So in October 2020, Patricia Fawkes, known as Trish, contacted us and began dialogue with the TED team, in particular Jane Burney, the age-friendly principal officer. And Jane and Trish are both with us on the call this afternoon. Trish is a resident of East Lindsay and herself aging without children, and she will be speaking later this afternoon. Working with Trish and looking at the issues of aging without children, we've become aware of how relevant this topic is to policy and service delivery. From the initial meeting last October, the journey of AWOC in East Lindsay began, firstly by having various conversations with the National AWOC Association, Councillor William Gray, the Better Ageing portfolio holder, Michelle Howard, the then Assistant Director, both from East Lindsay District Council, and support from Victoria Atkins MP, along with a lot of other groups and organisations and individuals who are interested in this. Secondly, in April of this year, an awareness event took place, leading to the launch event in May. That was our first AWOC group meeting. As I say, I won't go into too much detail, as I know some of the other speakers will go into a little bit more detail on their journey, and these will be covered later on this afternoon. So what Trish has done, with support from numerous individuals, has resulted in an online group meeting every fortnight to discuss matters affecting AWOCs, as well as hosting speakers detailed on the slide, so covering health and wellbeing, scams awareness, caring for your pets if you haven't got family around who will care for your animals. In the summer of this year, following discussions about the group, Mo Ray's research started, supported by the TED team, Trish, and numerous people across the district. Mo will be presenting her findings later this afternoon. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be useful for you just to realise and see the mission statement that the TED AWOC group set up. So the TED Ageing Without Children is working with individuals and organisations to raise awareness, provide support, and create a society in which those ageing without children feel recognised and understood. Next slide. The aim is to increase awareness of the experience of people ageing without children and the issues that they can face. Identify information and sources of support for people ageing without children. Facilitate a user-led social support group for people ageing without children. And also, and as this event shows, communicate local AWOC experiences into the national discussion about people ageing without children. So it now leads me on to then commence with the rest of the event, as I've given you some background information. And I'd now like to introduce you to our first speaker, Councillor William Gray. Thank you, William.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Jane, for that introduction. As Jane says, I'm William Gray, and as you can see there on the screen, I'm portfolio holder for Better Ageing at East Lindsay District Council. I thought I would just start with a few facts about East Lindsay. East Lindsay is a large, sparsely populated district, and we cover 700 square miles. We've got flat agricultural areas, we've got the rolling wolds, we've got historic market towns, and we've got seaside resorts, for instance, Skegness, Mablethorpe and Sutton-on-Sea. East Lindsay, though, has a higher than average ageing population. Approximately 30% of our residents are aged 65 and over, but projections show us that in the next 20 years, by 2041, this will rise to 40%, so that's a very big increase. As a district, we've been explicit in our commitment to support people to live and age well, but how have we done that? There are various initiatives to support people, and I just want to share briefly some highlights of our age-friendly journey at East Lindsay. Very importantly, though, there is commitment from the top of our organisation that we need to support people to live and age well. This includes the council's executive and our senior leadership team. And I think Emily Spicer, our Assistant Director for Wellbeing and Community Leadership, is actually joining us today. So I'm a member of the council's executive and portfolio holder for Better Ageing, as I've said, but I'm also older persons champion. And I've been the champion for over 10 years, and that's the only champion role that we have in East Lindsay at this moment in time. We've heard a little from Jane about the exciting TED programme, and we've heard for the past 7 years, we've had the ageing programme TED, meaning Talk, Eat, Drink in East Lindsay. And also we heard from Jane, it's just one of the 14 programmes throughout the county, which are funded by the National Lottery. But TED, very importantly, is a partnership of older people. It's older people working together, and they're working together with the voluntary and public sector agencies. And the overarching aims of the TED programme, as Jane alluded to, are to reduce social isolation and loneliness, which is very important in a rural district like East Lindsay, to help older people to become better connected with volunteering, improving health and social connections, and to learn new skills. And also what TED has done is provided opportunities for older people to influence the design and delivery of service, which is very important, because this has been a test and learn project, TED. And it's very, very important that these people have been able to evaluate the services available to them and also influence services and actually influence the businesses in the local area. Throughout the TED programme, various partners have been commissioned to do work in partnership with TED. And these have involved lots of individual organisations. One of those is Magna Vitae, and they've delivered the very successful Fitness, Food and Friends programme. Another is Links Digital. Links Digital have offered digital support and increased the use and knowledge of digital technologies. And we all know how important that has been during the pandemic period. These TED partnerships have been fabulous, and our thanks go to all the TED partners. It is clear that TED has been very successful, and it really has made a difference. And our gratitude goes out to Jane Adams and her excellent team. In 2019, East Lindsey became the first district council in the country to join the UK network of age-friendly communities, which we were very proud of. This was a further commitment to ensure that older people are at the heart of our plans to make our district a place where people are able to live healthily and active later lives. And we want our residents to live well for longer. East Lindsey is in partnership with the Centre for Ageing Better and Lincolnshire County Council. This is a strategic partnership which began in 2020 and runs through to June 2025. And I'm very pleased to see that Naz, the partnership manager, is with us today. Lincolnshire is the only rural partner in the country with the Centre for Ageing Better. And that's very, very important to us, that we actually are the rural partner. The other partners are more urban areas, they're Manchester and Leeds. Through this partnership, we're extending our commitment and vision beyond East Lindsey's borders, as you can see. And therefore, this partnership is about working across the whole of the county. We're working with a range of stakeholders to maximise knowledge, resources, expertise, and of course, impact. And by working together, we will secure the best outcomes and opportunities for people, both approaching and already in later life across the county. The partnership is focusing on the areas we know make a big difference to people's later lives. These include employment and volunteering opportunities, the homes that people live in, communities people live in, and of course, health. On the 1st of October each year, we have International Day of Older Persons. And in October the 1st in 2020, last year, Craig Leyland, as leader of East Lindsey District Council, was a signatory to a very important pledge with other leaders throughout the country to stamp out outdated attitudes to ageing. Our continued commitment has just been confirmed in the last few days. East Lindsey has been officially recognised as being a member of the global network of age-friendly communities by the World Health Organization. The assessment process to become accepted is very detailed and began with a baseline assessment. And it's based on what's known as the 8 domains of age-friendly. So the assessment looked at our housing and our housing needs within the district, the community support, what support was available, what health services were available, where the challenges were. It looked at our outdoor spaces, do they meet the expectations of older people? It looked at the buildings, were they accessible? It looked at social participation, how people liaise and react and interact with each other. Of course, respect and social inclusion are very, very important, and it looked at those important aspects. Civic participation, employment, and volunteering opportunities were all considered. And of course, the way in which we communicate with people. And very importantly, transport. Transportation is very important, as you will imagine, in a rural district like East Lindsey. Much of the work involved in this was to gain gained this recognition by the World Health Organization that we are an important area, an important district where we've been making some very, very great decisions and advances with regard to the work we're doing with our older community. And this work was carried out and managed by Jane Burney. Jane Burney is East Lindsey's first age-friendly principal officer, and Jane actually is with us today. And in fact, it was Jane who was also instrumental in collaborating with Trish to develop AWOC, Aging Without Children in East Lindsey. I just want to express our thanks to Jane. Jane Burney's dedication, her expertise, her personal commitment throughout a very difficult period of time during the COVID pandemic has really helped us become a member of the World Health Organization, this global network of age-friendly cities and communities. So our thanks go out to Jane. I mean, this is a true accolade for East Lindsey and our older residents. Our goal to support older people to live and age well is further endorsed by our commitment to ageing without children in East Lindsey. East Lindsey is very pleased to support this initiative and work with Trish. I attended the AWOC event in April, and I was very surprised to learn that 1 in 5 older adults are living without children. And as Jane said earlier, AWOC in East Lindsey also has the support of our MP Victoria Atkins, and she's been very interested to follow our journey so far. And I know there's going to be a meeting with her and some of the senior team in the new year. The COVID pandemic has certainly made us aware of the value and the need of personal and family connections. I know that's been very evident to me in my life. And therefore, even more so, the AWOC initiative and the research that it's doing is so very valuable. I'm really looking forward to hear from Trish this afternoon and learning more about what she's been doing. And also, I'm very interested to hear about the project findings from Professor Mo Ray. Well, that's all I'm going to say, just to thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you a little about our better ageing journey to date in East Lindsey. I'm very proud of the achievements that we've had at East Lindsey and what the team has achieved. And it really has been great partnership working that has allowed all of this to take place. Better ageing is now extending across the county, as I've said, which is great. And this shows that we are truly committed to our residents, and we really do want them to live and age well and have happy futures in East Lindsey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for that lovely insight into kind of the, East Lindsey's viewpoint and immense involvement from even before TED, that commitment was made. So thank you, William, for that real insight. So I'm now going to take you on to the next slide, which gives me the opportunity to introduce to you Trish, who we kind of wanted to give her a title, AWOC in East Lindsey founder. And actually that is really true. Trish, as I detailed before, came to us in October of last year, and Jane Burney was really instrumental in having that dialogue. So I'm now going to pass you over to Trish to talk about her involvement and her reasons behind wanting to set up this group. Over to you, Trish.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can carry on, Trish. We can see and hear you.
Well, I'm Trish Fawkes. I live in the county of Lincolnshire. I'm 72 and I'm ageing without children and a member and supporter of the national AWOC charity and our local AWOC East Lindsey group. I have no one, I have no family at all. I live with my dog Lily, and we blog as justmeandlily.co.uk. I'm originally from Leicester and was working as a civil servant when that's my parents and hubby and I, we moved here to buy and start a hotel in Skegness about 50 years ago now, sold it. And now I say I am very much from a sales background, different to the social care and etc. that most people here are from, but I am from a sales background. As in between, I set up and started my own estate agency in Skegness many years ago, which is now sold, which is a magic word for estate agents, obviously. So I was mighty honoured to be asked to speak today to such a venerable audience and by Dr. Hayden. And just at that point, I'm going to do an Oscar speech as well. And I'm going to thank the TED gang and everybody, Jane Burney, Jane Adams, Councillor William, Dr. Hayden, Mo, all of you for getting together and putting this AWOC group, small but perfectly formed AWOC group together. But I have to say Jane Burney because and Grace Tompkins, who's hit the ground running and really got the message for our group. And thank you for supporting us and staying with it and frankly becoming AWOCs yourself, really, almost. But on that subject, it is possible that 1 or 3 of anybody, I don't know, reading the promo or bio for me thought, who's she? I can't say I blame you, but here's the thing. I represent the people that you're probably going to be referring to or referred to at some point in your speeches. I represent those folks sitting in some of your care homes alone with no visitors at all because they have no one, no next of kin. Because, you see, what if, like me, you are aging without children, on your own, childless, as I am? I'm here because of this. And when aging and with no family to call on, no family on the end of the phone, it can be very lonely, frustrating, frightening, and isolating, with often, metaphorically speaking, nowhere to go for help, advice, or immediate contact. Forgotten, in other words. Forgotten was a word I used a lot. I'll tell this story when my ex-husband and myself began the Why Can't We Conceive route. When it was made clear that we were probably infertile after many tests, we wept with arms around each other in the hospital car park. We just broke down. We made the frankly brave decision to attempt adoption, and still we hoped, only to have our hopes dashed in a letter, much time and several social worker visits later. I was offered and took some hormone tablets. To be honest, every month we waited silently, but not to be. And then we stopped hoping and we gave up with the hope. And I guess it was a large part of our eventual divorce some years later. So from then to come right up to date and the COVID 2020 year, I was alone and officially shielding. And I found it insulting that no one, friends, neighbours, community, ever considered what it must have been like coping totally alone. Because if I got conversations on the phone, it was always about the grandkids. And that was the conversation, and it still can be. But sometimes I think it might be too uncomfortable for people to face the fact that I and other AWOCs haven't always been coping that well. And maybe they're afraid of getting involved, because I think sometimes they are. Sometimes people see you as a non-human. It's easier for them to face and deal with if you're invisibilized. So I looked online for others like me, and I came across Aging Without Children, the national group. And after emailing Kirsty Woodard, the original founder of AWOC, she phoned me and suggested I start a group here in Lincolnshire. So with the help of Ted Aging Better, East Lindsay, and the magnificent Jane Burney, we now have an online group who meet once a fortnight via Zoom. We had many meetings, Jane and I, when we started. We spoke to local media, we spoke to Melvin on Radio Lincolnshire, and one of us spoke to Victoria Atkins, our MP. It was supposed to have been 2 of us, but one of us couldn't get on Teams. And I'll say this, one of us couldn't get on Teams because that said person is an AWOC and no family to show how. It can be an issue, the computer, the Zoom, etc., for those of us without family to show us. But the good thing is, Jane did get to speak to Victoria, and Vicky does want to hear from us again. As Councillor Williams said, she does want to hear from us again, so she will do. Our group is slowly growing in numbers, and we're gradually turning ourselves into more of a campaigning outfit, raising awareness amongst those who've no idea of what living life without children nor family is like. So far, so good, except for me, sometimes it still isn't, because a lot of the concerns of being alone without any family, any children aging without family and children, those concerns are still there. Falling, for instance. This was mentioned at one of our groups the other week. What if you fall on your own and nobody knows? Somebody else said this, but I'll say it. What if you die? Because it happens alone in your home and nobody knows. And of course, I'm thinking I'm more concerned about my dog than me lying dead on the deck, to be honest. It's lonely, it's frightening sometimes, frustrating and isolating. You have no family in your corner to support you, to show you how to use the mute button on Zoom, or to edit your little video on iMovie. I pay someone to show me. Sometimes we pay for things, we AWOCs, that those with families take for granted. For instance, I pay for a taxi to take me to Lincoln Hospital to have a spinal injection. because somebody had to take you, and I hadn't got anybody. It's often it's your family. So I paid for a taxi who had to wait for me and transport me and bring me back. And it wasn't until I reached my later years, particularly in my 60s, when everybody's grandkids arrived and friends disappeared to be near them, that for the first time, I really felt the loss or lack of a child or children, particularly after my late partner died. And what you find as one ages, for me as an AWOC, medical problems reared ahead. For instance, I was told I needed a new hip. I put it off because I got no family or no one to move in and look after me, because at that time, that's what you had to have. I worried about my dog, what was going to happen to her. And so I didn't have my hips replaced. Without family to step in, it can be too complicated, to be honest, to sort. And on that subject, and I know this person's here somewhere, one of our AWOC members went into hospital recently. She doesn't mind me saying this, I asked her, for an operation on her foot, whereby she was told she mustn't put weight on this foot for several weeks. Well, she's an AWOC, exactly like us and exactly like me. She's got no family, nobody on her own. Well, that night, she inadvertently put weight on that foot. And she lay there weeping and worrying, convinced that she'd have to have an operation again, and convincing herself that she should put herself in a care home permanently, because just for safety reasons. And I've thought the same thing. I have gone through stages and evenings when I've thought that, and that would be wrong. She's only in her 60s. Because you find a lot of people aging without children or family place themselves in a care home for safety reasons, because these people are the ones sitting completely on their own with no visitors. AWOC's there because no one to care for them and look out for them. And by the way, my friend did manage to get social services to put a good care package together for us, so all is well. And then, of course, we come to Christmas, that a lot of we AWOCs do dread. I say a lot, not all. And when it's grandkids and families all over media as it is now, I look back at my Christmases past and I feel quite sad and lonely at that point. And I wonder what my mum and dad would be thinking if they were looking down. Because I say this, why does it no longer seem to happen that neighbours, families ask the person on their own to join them just for a glass of sherry or a glass of wine and mince pie for an hour or two, just to break Christmas Day up? Families can be exclusive now. As Councillor Williams said, be inclusive. Inclusive is the word. Because, you know, the feeling of loneliness you can feel when you see or pass a family walking the other side of the park or the pathway, and you move to let them by. And sometimes I've thought, they've no idea I'm here. No idea, I'm invisible to them. And yet there was one little thing that happened for me. I was walking the dog along near that little park near us. And there's a little family walking just the other side. And Lily was off her lead and she'd seen them. And Mum had got little baby twins in the pushchair and a little one hanging on the pushchair and a little chap at the front about 6 or 7. And I heard this yelling. And the little boy at the front was waving hello to me. And Mum was smiling, which is unusual. I tell you that, it's unusual, because often they go, oh, hurry up, like we're odd or something. And she was smiling. So I'm waving back, hello, hello. And this sort of went on. And then Mum just sort of waved goodbye. And that gave me such a warm feeling. And it kind of started me off on what I'm going to come to in a minute, how that sort of thing should be happening. Families can be quite lucky, and sharing a little bit of that luck with we AWOCs, I would really appreciate. And during our national Aging Without Children meetings, we've been discussing how we can involve and encourage communities more. Community involvement needs to be supported. I've got this idea, and I still think it's a good one, of families or people, ideally under 60, providing a one-to-one official contact or supervised friendship idea. It's quite simple. The officialdom won't be so simple, I realise that, to include all safeguarding and safety rules and regs, etc. But we need to be proactive, not reactive. Community is the buzzword. It seems to be in government at the moment. I was looking on Peston last night, and I think it was Theresa Coffey was on, or somebody was on talking about the government, the latest government social care reform bill, and community was mentioned. They're pouring some money into some sort of community plan. Goodness knows what it is. It's probably something they just slung out there, but obviously they're thinking communities have this place, because I think they do, but it has to be supervised. It's been suggested that this little idea, it's been suggested be trialled in a small area in our little local groups case, say like East Lindsay, it's not so little, and then hopefully rolled out. There's no reason why the older person couldn't contribute something financially towards it, I guess, depending on what it is. How do we sell it as a package to the community though? This is the thing, isn't it? By encouraging, supporting a community spirit, by encouraging altruism in society and within their own family setup, possibly encouraging a career in social care if any children are older, enjoying the experience and sometimes wisdom of an elderly person. Someone may have been caring for elderly parent or elderly parents, and now those parents have died, and that adult carer is left bereft, missing someone to care for. A lonely AWOC, say, having signed up for the community scheme, may fit their bill. Sometimes at this point, I've got visions of it being like Tinder, and families sitting there and swiping to the left, and no, not that one, but it wouldn't be like that, surely. But with work and officialdom in place, it is better than an AWOC sitting in a care home or draining the NHS, simply because AWOCs and people who are elderly and alone can sometimes be lonely, depressed, frightened, and lean on those services when we don't need to. With more of a caring community involvement, we may not need to quite as much. And I think AWOC can drive this. AWOC can drive this because we've started it now. We've started dialogue, as William said. But it does need to be supported, supervised, formalised so that it's sustainable. Otherwise it can fall apart, as we know. AWOC's motivation is simply not just raising awareness of ageing without children, but making a difference. Becoming AWOC aware is a good saying. AWOC aware, like a proverbial badge on your records, perhaps, for you to carry around. And then to make organisations AWOC aware. It would be a start. The ageing without children subject must become more mainstream. Because remember, the society that you're supporting and helping to form now is likely to be the society, those of you with children and grandchildren, it's likely to be the society that they're going to inherit. So make sure you're happy with it. Be kind, be compassionate, be supportive, be inclusive. And I am going to finish with my next of kin story. And it's this. I was in, because it's so typical. I was at the second jab, and we were in the big Boston Sports. It was like a tour around an aircraft hangar, to be honest. It was wonderful, brilliant, going swimmingly. And I was at the desk before the needle jab. Two ladies there ticking boxes, and I stood there, name, tick, tick. Next of kin, I don't have any. And she looked up with sort of hope to sort of say, cousins, nieces, nephews? I don't have any family. She went, it's all right, love. And I was double jabbed, but there was a third one. The third one, a bit more brutal, ticking boxes. And she said, she looked down, she said, is it still no next of kin? Is it still no next of kin? I felt like I wanted to say, no. In the last 6 months, I've acquired 2 nieces and nephew and 2 kids. Is it still no next of kin? It's no next of kin. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Trish, and thank you for your personal stories and insights into, you know, what you have lived. A very personal experience, but one that I know that you've been happy to share to give some background as to why you feel so passionate about this. And I think it is really, really important to hear the voice, as we've learned on the TED Aging Better programme, about people and listen to them and listen to their experiences. And as I'm seeing on chat, you know, people have found that your chat has been really fabulous and very moving. A few lumps in the throat here.
Oh, thank you, Jane.
I would ask you, obviously we've heard from Trish, please keep using the chat function, because it's always something really useful to engage in afterwards for any questions and observations that you do have. I'd now like to take the opportunity to kind of have a short comfort break before we go on to the next part. While we're having this comfort break, the slide that's on your screen at the moment is just obviously highlighting the fact that we do have an Aging Without Children meet on Zoom. So we're still meeting virtually, and that's fortnightly. And that is run in conjunction with TED. So our community officer, Grace, helps Trish facilitate those meetings. And we have had an immense amount of great speakers coming to the event, but also, as well as speakers, the opportunity for those that attend to talk about their experiences and share, you know, what it means to them being aging without children. So I'll leave this on the screen while we have a comfort break. I was envisaging that we will have a 10-minute comfort break, and I'm looking at my clock now, so we'll have 10 minutes. If we could reconvene just before 10:02, time's 14:38, so around about 10 to 3. And then I will have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Mo Ray from the University of Lincoln, to discuss her findings that she has done with the research that she has done. So if I could ask you to reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please. So thank you for rejoining us. And as I say, hope you've been able to stretch your legs and boil the kettle, make a cup of tea. And gives me great pleasure introducing Mo Ray from the University of Lincoln, who's been doing a lot of research, working with individuals and communities. And it's over to you, Mo.
Thanks very much, Jane. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon and to have the opportunity to share the initial findings from our exploratory research titled Aging Without Children in Rural Lincolnshire, an exploratory study. I'd also like to take the opportunity of saying, so I work in the School of Health and Social Care. I'm a social gerontologist and social worker by profession, and I spend a lot of time thinking about research, policy and practice around experiences of aging and aging, and I have a strong interest in social care research as well. And also, just to position myself in a personal context, I'm also someone who's aging without children, which has undoubtedly been, at least in part, a motivation for my interest in this topic and my previous research elsewhere in the country, looking at experiences of aging without children. I'd like to thank William and Trish, and of course Jane, for their input this afternoon, and also Jane Burney and Grace Tompkins for supporting the project. And very special thanks go to Hayden Bird and also to Tom George from the university for their assistance. And just very briefly, congratulations to East Lindsay for achieving status as members of the Global Network for Age-Friendly Communities via the World Health Organization. That's a really great achievement. Of course, it's very important when we think about any issue associated with aging and being an older person to underpin that with the recognition of the importance of accepting and celebrating the diversity that accompanies old age, as with any other part of the life course, which is characterized by diversity and difference. Old age is no different, and yet unfortunately, it is still often positioned as a homogenous experience, and it's anything but. And so it's really great to see that research such as this contributes, I hope, to highlighting aspects of diversity that until fairly recently have been somewhat hidden. I'd like to start by saying what we mean by ageing without children. So not this slide, I'm still doing my intro bits. So people may be aging without children for very many reasons. So the pathways to becoming a person who's aging without children can, as can old age, be very diverse. Sometimes people are aging without children because they've wanted children and for whatever reason have been unable to have children. And we've heard a very moving reflection from Trish this afternoon on that very issue. Otherwise, older people now who as they grew into young women and young men and into adulthood were able to control their fertility and control decisions about having children. So there are people who've made a positive choice not to have children for a variety of reasons. And sometimes people don't have children as a result of circumstance. Of course, there are people who have also had children who may also define themselves as aging without children. And I include in that group people, for example, who've lost a child or an infant through early death. Family conflict can break families apart, so children have no contact with parents. And even geographical separation, where parents don't see children for years at a time. And so although they are actively parents perhaps in the digital sense, in the practical sense, are separated from their children over long periods of time. Now, I recognise that there's nuance and difference in all of those pathways, but it really just highlights, I think, there's sort of different ways in which people may be or feel that they're aging without children. Now, traditionally, research focusing on people who are aging without children tended to see older people in that setting as childless. So they were defined as childless elderly or childless older. And in a sociological sense, they were defined as social deviants in the sense that they were outside the expected norms of achieving parenthood. The main message in that traditional research seemed to find that older people without children were uniquely vulnerable and uniquely disadvantaged. Now, over the past 10 or 15 years or so, I think research has begun to develop a better understanding, if you like, of how people age without children, which has gone some way to challenging the assumption that people who are childless are a homogenous group of people, i.e. all essentially the same. And so too has the assumption that aging without children will inevitably be a bad experience and have negative consequences. As you've already heard, the growth of national and indeed local organisations representing the voice and interests of people ageing without children, led by and for people ageing without children, has really impacted, I think, on raising awareness, probably more so than my research papers might ever do, and has begun to challenge policy and promote the idea of a positive life without children. So arguably, though, ageing without children continues to often be constructed as a stigmatized status. I think women in particular may be very much susceptible to being labelled in terms such as immature, selfish, irresponsible, or being overtly career focused. Reinforcing the idea perhaps of motherhood as the core identity of women. That's certainly something that's been levelled at me, that I didn't have children because I was too interested in my career. Examples exist, such as the experience of Julia Gillard, who was Australia's first woman Prime Minister, who was vilified at times in the media for not having children. And similarly, Theresa May in the leadership campaign some years ago was temporarily given negative coverage as a result of not having children. And of course, you've only to look at the recent media coverage around COVID to assume that behind every older person, there is a family waiting to provide care. And the experience of people who live alone or who live without family or who do not have children didn't really enter the consciousness through media or any other cultural representation of ageing. So why is it important to think about researching ageing without children? Next slide, please. At first, I want to say that despite these positive shoots of development that I've just mentioned, people who are ageing without children still remain predominantly invisible in policy and practice. Second, while there have always been, throughout history, people who've been ageing without children, those numbers have been fairly invisible, but we've got better data now on on the numbers of people who are ageing without children. And in 2019, the Office of National Statistics suggested that the numbers of women aged 80 and over without children is expected to increase from 23,000 in 2019 to 66,000 by 2045. And of course, that's a fairly confident estimate, given the age of women, the fertility space that women tend to have, and the fact that these women are already here, they're alive and on the planet. As I've said, policy tends to be usually based on the assumption that older people have children who are willing and able to provide practical assistance and care, or to help with care. And we really do need to, through research such as this and other kind of means, to unsettle some of those assumptions about what it is to be an older person. Despite growing evidence that ageing without children doesn't necessarily lead to a necessarily diminished or impoverished life, ageing without children is still positioned with justification as a risk factor, and I'll say more about that later. And I think hearing the voice and experience directly, as we've done with Trish this afternoon, from people who are ageing without children is important. So early research tended to be quantitative, so it was statistical, and the actual the visibility of the experience of people who are ageing without children was not present at all. And I think the other thing that research needs to do is to tease out what aspects of ageing without children may lead to specific policy and practice sensitivities or developments, and I think that's really important. To our knowledge, there's been no UK-based research which has explored how living in a rural and coastal environment may impact on the experience of ageing without children. And this is the focus of the exploratory study that I'm presenting today. And I'm grateful to TED for their support in this happening. And above all, I want to express my sincere gratitude to the men and women who gave their time to this study in a very selfless and open way, and responded with enthusiasm to the project and recognised its potential importance. And their enthusiasm really made the project not just, I hope, successful, but also an absolute joy to work on. So thank you. And if any of you are here, I hope you're hearing my thanks loud and clear. Next slide, please. So as I've said, the study was exploratory, and we carried out in-depth interviews with men and women identified as ageing without children. Just for information, most were carried out via Microsoft Teams and Zoom or the telephone, but very much based on individual preference. And a minority of interviews were carried out face-to-face in a location which allowed for socially distanced and COVID secure research. We have to sort of say that, I guess, in this COVID times. We interviewed 18 people and also 3 couples. In other words, we interviewed 3 men and the rest were women, which I guess would count as a research limitation. It's not the first time that it's not always been easy to identify men who might fit this kind of group. And so that's something that we have to be aware of. All of the participants were living in the district of East Lindsay. And I used a process for analysing these very rich, detailed interviews called thematic analysis, which identifies through a process of coding and grouping together themes, a number of key themes, which I present here today under these headings. So let's take a look, first of all, at the participants' experience of pathways to ageing without children. Next slide, please. So in line with other research, as I've just said, the project highlighted and supported findings of other research that the pathways to ageing without children for participants was definitely diverse. And there are a number of people, for example, who, for whatever reason, variety of different reasons, had made a positive and conscious choice not to have children. And this, as I say, is an important opportunity of choice in terms of being able to control one's fertility. So what kinds of reasons might have led to a positive choice? So sometimes practical circumstances such as early financial hardship in a marriage affected decisions to avoid having children initially, which then became a longer term choice and then solidified into a choice that was going to remain settled. Some people identified concern about population growth and population sustainability, and also global sustainability, and sort of raised the question of, you know, sort of some anxiety about bringing more children into the world. Others simply commented that they didn't feel maternal or paternal. And I was very struck by the number of times that people followed that up with the statement along the lines of, but that doesn't mean I don't like children. So there's still a kind of a stigma attached to saying, I don't really want children. I didn't really feel that way about having children, but I do. That doesn't mean I don't like children. I really like children. Sort of that sort of sense that I have to kind of justify that experience. From a biographical perspective, early trauma such as childhood abuse, parental and mental and physical health, and family breakups influence decision making for some participants. So here's an extract from an interview. When I met my future husband, we discussed before we got married what we felt we wanted to do and whether to have children. And we decided that we did not want children. Basically, he'd come from a broken marriage, and I had parents who were always rowing when I was a teenager. And I just thought, well, do we want to bring a child into this? We thought, we're not that bothered, so we didn't. For older non-heterosexual men and women, it was considered impossible or not appropriate during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s to become a parent, even if it was something that was personally wished for. Here's a comment. I would have loved to have had children, but with work, it just didn't happen. And I think nowadays there are circumstances for LGBTQ people that can make becoming a parent achievable, but it just wasn't when I was at that age. Some people planned to have children, but were unable to conceive or experienced the unfortunate experience of successive miscarriages or the death of a child in infancy or as a small child. Participants in this group, I would say, were more likely to reflect on the experience of long-term and hidden, sometimes called disenfranchised grief, which is a hurt or a pain that you carry across your life, which is often not terribly visible, but it's something that you're aware of, that you live with, and that can sometimes be brought into very sharp focus as you go through life. And again, Trish has referred to perhaps some of those experiences herself. So here's a comment from someone who wanted but could not have children. I think there are about 6 treatments available. And in the 70s, the attitude was very unsympathetic. The hospital wasn't arms around you. It was quite brutal in some ways. It is a loss. You have to deal with it because life is hard. When we were younger, I dealt with it pretty well. Nights out and all that sort of thing. It was perhaps a bit of a bonus because there was nobody to babysit. Perhaps it's a selfish thing, but now I'm thinking, and as I've got older, and as I've gotten out to my stage in life, I'm thinking how sad really it's like that because you haven't got anybody. Participants experienced mixed experiences in the extent to which they felt judgment or disapproval in a society which continues to view parenthood, despite the diversity, it continues to view parenthood as a normal and expected part of adult life. So participants who'd made a positive choice not to have children in this study seemed to be much less likely to feel stigmatized as a consequence of their choice. And this perhaps reflects the experience of feeling settled about the choice that they'd made, but also perhaps the potential for them to have additional personal resources to invest in developing their lives as a single person or as a couple without children. And people who wish for children and who were unable to have children were perhaps more likely to reflect on the experience of stigma or otherness, because they were having to come to terms with the reality of not being a parent, and also potentially constructing their situation as one of failure against the normative expectation of parenthood. Time spent in trying to conceive a child, or living with the realities of child loss, or not being able to have children, may also reduce the personal resources that individuals and couples have to invest in a life without children, because the hope was kept alive over a period of time that they might succeed in becoming a parent. And here's someone commenting on just that thing. They say, "I think it made my partner quite bitter. And now when he talks, she says, well, they're all right because they've got children, or they've got backup, or they've got support." However, even though most participants did not feel judged for not having children, they still reflected on a sense of feeling sometimes at odds with children who had children, with people who had children. Conversations with friends could often revolve around children and the doings of grandchildren, leaving participants sometimes feeling that they didn't have much to offer in return. Social time with friends who were grandparents could often be restricted by grandparent care. You know, given the parlous state of childcare in this country and the cost of it, grandparents are often expected or encouraged or looked to provide grandparent care. And so here's someone commenting about that very experience. "My friend, she has loads of grandchildren. There's always a grandchild. And as much as I like children, I don't want to be sat there doing Play-Doh all of the time when I'm meant to be having coffee with my friend." For a minority of participants, they felt isolated in rural communities, which can wrongly assume that everyone who lives there is in a heterosexual marriage with children. This could impact on the extent, I think, to which people felt comfortable in social groups or activities. And at its worst, I think it could create feelings of isolation or exclusion. So here's someone commenting now. "We joke about it. You do feel different. First thing, people ask you. You meet someone new and it's, have you got any children? No. It's almost like a conversation stopper. I always say, I've got lots of family, and it's as though you've failed somehow in life, not producing children. You meet people who think you've failed." I'd like now to turn to the theme of living in a rural environment. So if we could have the next slide, please. So the participants who had lived in rural Lincolnshire all of their lives were in this study something of a minority. And this again, I think, constitutes perhaps a research limitation in our failure to reach out to people who were lifelong inhabitants. Most of the participants in the study had either left the county as young adults, so they were born here and left the county as young adults and returned to retire, or in common with many other older people, regardless of whether they have children, were retirement migrants. Now, while there's probably little difference between people aging without children and the older population in general in terms of wanting to perhaps retire to a nice house in the country, it is striking that most of the participants in the study often felt completely free and unconstrained, for example, by family obligations to remain where they were, or to be limited about where they went in their decisions about ultimately where they moved to retire. So this is a perfect example. I was watching Escape to the Country and they featured Lincolnshire. So we decided to have a holiday there and have a look, and it snowballed from there. And ultimately this person bought a house in East Lindsay and retired here. As you can see from the quote on the slide in front of you, and certainly reinforced by many other retired participants who've migrated into the area, affordability and the beauty of the environment were major features of their decision making. So moving to a beautiful countryside, solitude, to a lovely house and garden that was substantially larger than anything you might be able to afford, for example, in the south of the country, was an important motivation. And for most people, it realised an important retirement aspiration in terms of healthy people in their 50s and 60s, looking forward to a busy and active retirement, gardening, country life, and often getting involved in local activities, and for many, volunteering and civic activities as well. In our interviews, very few participants recalled actively considering the availability of resources or considering their purchase in light of future ageing or future ageing as for someone who is ageing without children. Now, I'll return to this topic of in relation to health and well-being shortly, but I'd like now to turn to the question of social connections and networks. Next slide, please. Many of the participants in this study, with some notable exceptions, had strong local connections that they'd achieved via, for example, a tranche of volunteering, joining local groups and developing local friendships, and some people, a minority, but some people through continued work, paid work. And previous research has certainly suggested that people who are ageing without children may have skill in developing wider social networks simply because they have more time to do that, whereas people who are busy raising children and raising families have a more narrow focus or a more inward-looking focus on their immediate family life, and potentially a narrower social world in terms of opportunities for making friendships. It's an interesting thought, but it does lack evidence. So I wouldn't want you to go away thinking that's a kind of a strong evidence base, but it's certainly been discussed through research. Most of the participants, as I've said, were retired and enjoyed well-developed social connections, and involvement in a variety of voluntary and citizenship roles. And for some participants, their voluntary and civic roles were almost a full-time job. They gave a massive amount to the community. And this is certainly, again, something that's been demonstrated in other research on people who are ageing without children. The very significant voluntary and civic activities that people who are ageing without children often do. However, it was also true to say that a number of participants said they'd scaled back some of their activities as they felt that their energy levels had dwindled somewhat of late. Given that most people in the sample were actually retirement migrants, connections with family could be, or was more likely to be, at a distance, and was also more likely to focus on perhaps more distant relatives with infrequent contact. And of course, some participants had no surviving relatives, and they were literally the last one standing, and you've heard about that already this afternoon. And so their reliance on friendships was ever more important. The pandemic, as it did with all people, unfortunately impacted on events, as we're all very well aware. And this, of course, was an issue for many older citizens, but participants in this study were more likely to express feeling lonely or isolated and excluded if they were perhaps newer to the area, if they lived alone, had few or no surviving family members, and also if they were experiencing health difficulties which limited their ability to travel outdoors and to perhaps to meet when meeting outdoors was allowed in socially distanced contact. So here's a comment from somebody in that very situation. Since the pandemic, everything has come to an end. There are no groups or activities, and it's been absolutely horrible. I wanted my husband here, and I kept on thinking about him, and it got quieter and quieter, and I miss him so very much. I have good friends in the activity group that she referred to, and we've been telephoning each other and making sure we're all right. And I have a friend who does the garden for me and any odd jobs, but it is so very lonely. I'd like now to return to the issue of health and well-being. If I could have the next slide, please. A number of participants had good health with no implications for their activities of daily living and the things that they enjoyed and wanted to do, which is fantastic. However, for a number of people in this study, health had started to change. And while many people saw this as the realities of getting older and found ways to positively accommodate to change, there were certainly underlying concerns about the management of large properties, gardens, and the wider environment, and who you might draw on if that became more difficult. And of course, people were starting to think about how they might actually manage that. So here's someone commenting on some of the environmental challenges they experience. It's got worse, and I can't walk very far without getting breathless. It takes all of the breath out of me, and once it takes the breath out of me, it reacts to everything else. I have got a big garden and I want to get out there, but I can't. The other unfortunate part of living in this village is that every road leads in from a hill. Where we live, you can't walk up to the village without stopping 3 or 4 times to get our breath. Whereas when we first moved here, we used to do a 3-mile circuit, no problem at all. And this person was reflecting on concerns about increased isolation, and as not terribly, fairly recent retirement migrants, although they had good friends, there were some concerns about sort of future isolation as that health condition worsened. In common with many people, participants in this study invariably said that they had not actively planned for future aging and the potential for their needs to change, and their potential for their needs to change in light of aging without children. So here's a comment. I didn't really think about the aging part. It was mainly cost. This was an unbelievable price, the house, and we just jumped on it. And we thought, anything else was an afterthought. It's only then that we heard all the bad stories about the NHS not being good here. One doctor in the whole area, and it's really hard to get through to the surgery and so on. And my wife is now a bit worried about it if she needs healthcare. For some people with changing health, adaptations to an existing home were considered, and others were starting to actively consider the need to move into town or nearer to facilities. Now, this was really important for people who were aging alone, who were very worried about being someone who became increasingly isolated and potentially socially excluded because they had no family or limited family, and certainly no near family. And also if they didn't have a partner, or also were worried about what would happen if their partner predeceased them, or indeed the other way around, what would happen if either of them was left alone. So some people were starting to actively consider alternative housing to try to head off the potential risks that were associated with this. Now, again, of course, thinking about right sizing, if you like, is not uncommon to the experience of aging. But as I say, participants who lived alone and who didn't have any close family or friends, for those people with changing health, that could present and indeed did present a worry, not necessarily a massive worry for some, but the beginnings of a worry, for some a more significant worry, and for some a significant risk. Losing a life partner was also an understandable concern for participants who relied on their partners day by day. And again, research evidence does suggest that people who are aging without children, who are partnered, who are in long-term partnerships, will often have very close partnerships because of the fact that they've made a life between themselves, especially if they have few surviving or distant family relatives. So here's a quote which illustrates that comment. We're both now talking about what our next move would be. Depending on our abilities, it will probably be nearest town or a small village. We've looked at places, of course, somewhere closer where you can actually get to a shop or get to health services. That does worry us being out here. There's not a lot of access, but we will stay for as long as we can. We'd rather make the move while we can make the move. So we're thinking probably another 10 years. So again, they're starting to sort of think about, well, we'd like to make a move in a proactive way rather than being pushed out of the door, because circumstances mean that everything's fallen apart. But they're sort of looking at, sort of a plan for the future. But of course, for some people, the thought of making a move or doing anything big like that, you know, sort of a big transition or a big change of life, was a worry in terms of managing the task of right sizing, with concerns about who you could draw on for help with this kind of size of job. You know, the availability of informal sources of help was clearly a worry for a number of participants, particularly people who were living alone without children. Who could I ask for transport? Who could I help load a skip if I was going to move? What happens if I lose the ability to drive and I'm on my own? How do I manage the sort of the complexity? As we all know, moving house in this country, if you're buying another house, always seems to be difficult. So, you know, how do I manage that, you know, on my own? These were the kinds of worries that people were starting to sort of float out and express. Many of the participants were only too well aware of the challenge of getting care services into rural areas, and some of the people in the study had experienced this firsthand through their volunteering and civic activities. While few of the participants in the study actually had care needs, some did, but few did, and it was regularly reflected as a potential future need. There was a very strong awareness that, you know, at some point in an indefinable future, I may need care. And it was also recognised that as someone who is ageing without children, I may need care more quickly, or I may need a different type of care more quickly than if I perhaps had you know, a sort of family around and about. So while access to care is likely to be a concern for many older people in general, participants highlighted worries as ageing without children around securing care without support or assistance when one's personal and physical resources are depleted. And for people living alone and without friends or families, managing a crisis or a sudden change in health was also a background worry. And again, I think you heard Trish mention that very thing. Participants were also very well aware that having children did not, and indeed should not, mean that they were there to look after ageing parents, despite national policy, which aspires to the contrary. But participants did note the absence often of a close person just to, this is a quote, to kick stuff around with. You know, that idea of having a close person who you could perhaps talk options through around housing, or talk around care options, or talk about, you know, possible next steps. And the realities of making important future decisions was particularly stark for people who were not married or partnered, or who had recently been widowed or separated. So here's a quote: realizing that as you're getting older and, you know, perhaps your mental capacity starts to become compromised, you actually do need an advocate, just someone to stick up for you if you can't do it, not necessarily to care for you, not necessarily to go and live with them. I wouldn't expect kids to be responsible for me, but it would be lovely to know that if somebody was there looking out for you as you were getting older and you haven't got that, and that's a big gap you feel as you get older. I feel that as I get older. Legal and personal affairs could also pose a difficulty for people who are ageing without children. It's not always easy to ask a distant relative or a friend, for example, to act as a lasting power of attorney for crucial decisions about care or finance, bearing in mind that those people will be making decisions about you and for you because you have lost decision-making capacity in regards to that particular issue. For people without family, there were decisions about disposing of an estate. You know, if you're the last one standing, what happens to your estate? And having to make decisions about who you might ask to act as executor, or how you might go about involving a legal professional to help with that. And whilst most participants had thought about and made some of those arrangements, not all of them, those who couldn't think of a suitable alternative or a suitable arrangement tended to postpone decision-making, leaving them potentially vulnerable should something happen that was unexpected. Here's a comment. At the moment, it's my partner, but we're going to have that difficulty in future. Who do you put down as your next of kin? It would probably be my sister. People are going to be making those decisions throughout the rest of your life. and not wanting to be a burden to them, but you have to put somebody down. Finally, participants were asked to reflect, based on their status as ageing without children, on their experience of rural living and how an age-friendly community could or should respond to and reflect the diversity of ageing experience, and specifically the experience of ageing without children. Next slide, please. Here are some of the themes that were identified. Not surprisingly, transport came up, and worries about what would happen if a person who's ageing without children could no longer drive. Reflecting on the challenge of asking people to help, especially with regular transport, was considered to be awkward. And I think it's also worth saying that people who are ageing without children have been responsible for making their own decisions all of their lives. And they are very independent, and especially if they've lived alone. And it's difficult for most of us in a modern society to ask for help, particularly from strangers. And this was something that played out a lot in a number of participant narratives. And it's also fair to say that the transport that existed was perceived by a significant number of the participants as not being very flexible. In terms of housing, people who are ageing without children highlighted the need for a much greater level of creativity in housing options for older people, which reflected diversity of need, but also diversity of identity, diversity of interest. For example, mixed communities were cited, which embraced people of all ages and with different backgrounds and circumstances to create sort of community, housing communities. Housing which offered care on site was also identified as a potentially important option, so housing with care, as this could avoid the stress and difficulty for people who are on their own trying to find care and manage care, on their own. Affordable housing and the possibility of, for example, cooperatives, housing cooperatives for people who are living alone, and schemes such as shared lives were also cited. Social spaces and opportunities for socialising in housing communities was also highlighted as potentially very important for people who are not closely connected to or who had no family, and who may struggle to, for example, reach out to distant friends if their health changed. In terms of health and care, getting help to navigate care and health was a concern for the participants, and especially if it related to changing decision-making capacity and declining health. Some people overtly expressed a concern that they were more at risk of being in a care home if they had care needs which couldn't be funded by social care and which they couldn't fund themselves. And that's a perfectly realistic concern, because based on the data that we have, it certainly seems to be the case that people who are living alone, and therefore people who are more likely to be ageing without children, are at greater risk of entering a care home earlier than their counterparts with families and partners. It also seems to me, although there's no, again, data on this, but based on my earlier research around people who pay for their own care, it also seems to me that people who pay for their own care are also more likely to be ageing without children. And again, are left to manage a fragmented and complex social care landscape, often on their own. And we have almost no research on the experience of lone residents in care homes, i.e. people who do not have any visitors or who have no named relative. But based on research from North America, we do see that people who are ageing without children are at greater risk of being lone in care homes. And that's a piece of research that is in my sights to look at next. Ageing without children, people who are ageing without children, many of the experiences that people had were in many regards common to the experiences of older people in general, regardless of their parental status. However, there are, as I've hoped to illustrate today, some very crucial differences. And there is, we would argue, a need to consider further policy making visible the experience of people ageing without children, not just their potential risks and potential needs, but also their very many resources and capabilities and the fantastic contribution that they make to rural communities. We would also argue that, for example, people who are ageing without children are more likely to be involved in informal and unpaid care. And I think it's important that carers' assessments should be sensitive to individual circumstance. Similarly, Care Act assessments of need should also take seriously understanding more about people's social networks, whether they're ageing without children, and whether there are any potential implications associated with that. We would argue that the active involvement of people who are ageing without community in developing age-friendly communities and services is fundamentally important. And the potential for long-standing loss, bereavement and sadness and unresolved grief should be considered in any kind of formal involvement with people who are ageing without children. And also the importance of thinking about the sorts of vulnerabilities that people might have around things like legal frameworks, decision-making, complex decision-making, and practical assistance and help. So that's everything that I wanted to say for now, but I think Jane's going to now just briefly mention the brief that we've developed as a first output from this project. I'll just pass you to Jane for a second. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo, and what an amazing insight into the research that has been carried out. And you'll see on your screen that Mo has produced a briefing paper, the front page shown here, which obviously draws on findings from the research project, goes into them in a lot of detail. This report will be available on the TED website and on the HARG blog, and you will see the addresses are shown on this slide. We will also distribute the report to all of the attendees to this event over the coming days. So we will be sharing that, and I hope that you know, when you receive it, it will give some more information and touch on obviously as the information that Mo has given you this afternoon, which is incredibly detailed but really insightful into what she's found. I do know that Mo is also doing some more work around health. And so Mo, I wondered if you'd just like to provide a short update on the current and future work that you have in this area.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to produce 2 more briefings, one on health and care and one on rural environments, and they'll be produced over the next weeks. And I'm also working with Hayden and Tommy George on an article which is going to go in Rural Health and Care, looking at the experience of people ageing without children. As I mentioned, I have in my sights the desire to undertake some research on the experience of lone older people living in care homes, and that's something that I would hope to be able to update you about over the coming months. Obviously, I've got to bid for money to be able to do that piece of research, so that's not on the blocks yet. And also, people may be interested in the briefings around older people who self-fund and pay for their own social care, because as I alluded earlier, that has particular resonance, well, for older people, but it has resonance for older people who are ageing without children. I was very struck by the high numbers of participants who did not have children in my sample, and also other samples in the other research sites that we undertook. And you may also be interested to know that we've just recently produced a film and also a briefing about a piece of research that we did on keeping older people with their companion animals together when an older person faces moving into a care home, because they're often care homes either don't advertise or they don't take animals. And again, my view is that people who are ageing without children may be particularly vulnerable to being separated from companion animals if they lack an advocate, especially if decision-making capacity has become compromised. And so that's also available on the HARG blog. So if anyone's interested in any of that, I think my email is somewhere on this presentation, and I'll put it in chat. So if you're interested in any of those products or in having further conversations with me about any of that, or indeed joining in with any of the HARG events, please don't hesitate to contact me. I believe that we're going to have some questions, and can I please make a plea? If there are any policymakers here or practitioners to perhaps try and think about any kind of pledges or promises about ageing without children that you might be able to take away this afternoon and determine that you're going to turn into an action for East Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo, for that. I'm now very aware we're kind of coming towards the end of the session, but this is the really, everything's important, but I think it's really important to have your questions. So I'd now like to open up the next sort of just under 10 minutes to some questions. And I know that some of the team behind the scenes have been monitoring chat. So I wonder if I could call on one of the team, I think Hayden, who's our TED Learning and Evaluation Officer, to perhaps pose the first question to a member or one of the speakers. Thank you.
I think we've covered quite a lot of this in today's presentations, but I was just be interested. I think Smaida made an interesting remark about what AWOC, being AWOC aware means for the panel in their day-to-day lives. How does that kind of look and feel, really?
Okay, I can start by kind of answering what being AWOC aware means to TED. I think from the point of view that we've been able to provide a platform and a voice for the AWOCs in East Lindsay, following Trish coming to us, so that they're able to tell their story. Our aim has really been to support the group, but then making organisations, individuals, policy and service delivery makers to be aware of the group and to hear their stories. Because I know one of the many issues affecting people ageing without children is the absence of someone telling their story. And I think today's event is a classic example where hopefully we've been able to tell the story from Trish's personal perspective, but also we've been able to gather through Mo's research some really key points for policymakers to take away and have a think about, well, what can they do to action, as Mo has said. So I don't know whether any of the other speakers would like to say what they feel about being AWOC aware is.
I think it's about, it's all part of the diversity piece for me, recognising that ageing is a diverse experience. It's not a homogenous experience. And I think we're getting better at that. But I think when we think about policy, we can quite often tend to think about, the biggest group or the dominant group of people. So I think being ageing without children aware means recognising that there are people who do not have family, for whom normative policy does not really fit, and who need to be considered and included and involved in developments, policy and practice and age-friendly developments in communities.
Super, thank you, Mo. I don't know whether Trish or William have got any views on that.
Yes, please, Jane. I mean, that was just brilliant, Mo. Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? But when Mo was talking about housing, and I think it brings me back to my big thing about community again. I'm so keen on this. For AWOCs, it's AWOC driven, but housing was something I was talking about to Kirsty, actually, Kirsty Woodard, that why can't there be, I don't know, housing, I can imagine this sort of little community of housing just for AWOCs, because there's going to be a lot of us and a lot more of us. And housing, they can, like social housing, and Kirsty said there is something down south, but they're very expensive. Well, they don't have to be expensive. It's a sort of social care thing, but we look after ourselves. As AWOCs, we look after each other. We don't have to have some manager there, or we organise that ourselves, but it's just AWOCs. It's just an idealistic thing I got in my head. And because there are a lot of us, there's going to be a lot more of us. They don't want us in social care homes or clogging up the NHS. And it's because there's nobody there to look after us or care for us. We have nowhere else to go at the moment. And, they are clearly thinking about it. They're thinking about communities. It needs to go a stage further, I think, and who lives in these communities, who needs the care in communities.
Jane, I don't know if I can sorry, can I just add something, Jane, to follow on from what Trish has just said, if that's possible, about housing? There are lots of conversations regarding housing at this moment in time that are happening in the county, and lots of people have heard of extra care schemes. The buzzword now is extra care light. And so literally developments along the lines of what Trish has just spoken about, it's not an extra care scheme, but it's extra care light. So there is a communal lounge. So there is more access to services, information, contacts. And we will see a lot more in the years to come in this county of extra care light. Councillor Wendy Bokett, who's the executive member at the County Council for Adult Social Care, she's leading on this. I chair Housing, Health and Care Delivery Group. We're very much involved with that. So Trish, hold that thought, because there's a lot more coming with extra care light and the exact type of housing schemes that you're talking about.
That's brilliant, William. Brilliant. That's great. I hope that's not going to be too long, though, because I'd like to take advantage of that.
Not too long, Trish. I daren't say where in Horncastle.
Oh,
there is a site in Horncastle, Trish, yes, your hometown, already identified for such a scheme. It's just the funding packages are being brought together by the county council. They are talking to East Lindsay about it. And there is a scheme of extra care light coming to Horncastle.
Oh, great, William. I mean, that is good news. Really good news.
Super, thank you. I'm going to ask Hayden if there's some. I know we have got quite a lot of questions. I know we're probably not going to cover all of them, but Hayden, have you got another question that you can
yes, we spoke with Richard Cunnington during the break, and I said that I would hand over to Richard if you had any questions. I notice your hand is, well, your virtual hand is up anyway, Richard, so please feel free to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Hayden. Yeah, I just hearing from Trish, I take it she's not in Skegness anymore. Is that correct?
I'm not in Skegness anymore. No.
Okay, well, if you...
I was for many, many years.
Yeah, well, if you've got anybody that actually is, obviously I'm a district and town councillor and willing to be contacted for anything. You touched on housing. I'll have a chat with Will Gray about that, because I've noted that. And there's another couple of things, but no, if you're not in Skeg anymore, there's nothing I can do to be of any use to you. But if you know of anybody that is, more than willing to give my details, and I'll contact Will Gray in the future. Thank you.
Great news. Great news from William and Richard there then.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. I appreciate your input there. Hayden, have we probably got time for, unfortunately, one last question that you may have?
Yeah, I suppose we could direct this to both Trish and Mo. I think we've hinted at some of the stuff around building communities, but just reflecting on COVID-19 and obviously the kind of lockdowns we had, are there any ways in which Trish and Mo think that we could have engaged communities more effectively, that we could connect people more effectively despite the sad circumstances of social distancing, really?
Yes, I'll take that one, Hayden, to start with, if that's okay. Yes, I mean, it was a shock, wasn't it? So, I mean, everybody was reacting in COVID. It was reaction, and you can understand that totally. And we were all very scared. But, you know, my idea of community somehow being formalised, because all I want really is a contact. I want to have a contact in my community, not somebody who I'm going to be a pest to and then just turn up at the door. It has to be something somehow that's formalised and supervised by district council or whichever council it is. Somehow it has. I understand it said yesterday that government are allowing a load of money for communities. They'd included communities in their social care package. So they're obviously thinking that. That was, it's quite vague what they said, but they're clearly thinking that communities is the way forward. And it would be for me to involve them more, to make them more aware, as I'm an AWOC, more AWOC aware. But the fact that it isn't just about, of course, their priority is their family, but sometimes they need to be inclusive with the little bit of luck that they have to have this family. And those of us on our own, we've missed out on that. And it's how we sell it, really. It's how we sell this whole thing. I don't know if William wants to say, oh yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Trish. On the pandemic thing, yeah, in the pandemic, of course, there was a lot of people who needed help and assistance. And we'll all know that during the pandemic, lots of COVID support groups set up. And there was hundreds of them all over our county. At YMCA, we supported over 100 of those particular schemes. The TED really stepped up to the plate, and they had Connect TED, so their offer that they deliver in East Lindsay suddenly went all over the county, so TED did a fabulous job. There's Good Neighbour schemes. The Good Neighbour schemes did a great job. And what came out of that was that people just really wanted befriending. They wanted that friendly chat on a regular basis, someone just to catch up with every week, maybe just for 10 minutes, half an hour, but that regular contact, etc., etc. And what that regular contact chat did was they could then tell somebody if there was an issue, and they could signpost. So it's very important to have this contact, Trish, that you're talking about. And during COVID-19, we saw a lot of that. Now we just need to harness that and take that further forward to formalize it. I think that's what you're saying. And so believe me, there's a lot of people thinking about it as we speak, Trish.
Oh, great. That's good. It's got a lot of good news here, William. I'm liking this, but I'm glad you sort of feel that there is something there that could move forward.
Without that doubt there is. So colleagues are starting to chat, and of course we will involve you in that, because you've instigated a lot of these conversations. You will be involved in that, Trish.
Thank you very much, William. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if there's anything more to add in response to that question. I'm very aware that we definitely haven't had enough time to ask some of the questions posed to speakers. And so if this is the case, we will endeavour to get back to you with answers or comments to those, as we have obviously contact details. We're also very aware that some of what you've heard today may be upsetting. So please do get in touch with us if you want support. Or we also offer the service of Silverline, which is a free phone number 0800 470 8090 if you feel that you've been affected by anything that you've heard today. As I mentioned, we will be sending out the briefing paper to all of those that have attended over the coming days. But I would like to say a big thank you to all the speakers and all those involved in making this event happen, because as some of you may know, there is a lot that goes on behind the scenes before, during and after the events, and I could not do it without members of the TED team and all the speakers. So thank you very much for all of your time in helping put this into place. I would finally like to say a big thank you for all those that have attended. I do hope this has been useful, thought-provoking, and a benefit to you to know that actually we are, taking the lead in working and really kind of giving AWOCs a voice, as I mentioned in my being AWOC aware. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us if you would like to know more. You've got Mo Ray and Hayden Bird, who's the TED Learning Evaluation Officer, contact details on screen. Any reflections that you've got, we are more than happy to take, so please do get in touch. So I'd like to thank you for your time. So thank you, stay safe and take care. Thank you.